All right, welcome back to Second Half Stewardship, where we explore our role as stewards of everything that God provides. Today, we're excited to interview Jeff Haanen. Jeff founded the Denver Institute of Faith and Work and wrote a book recently about retirement called An Uncommon Guide to Retirement, Finding God's Purpose for the Next Season of Life. If you're watching this video, you'll notice that Jeff is not in his wisdom years. He's more mid-career. Jeff, we're really thankful that you have joined us here today. So as you approached writing a book on retirement as not being someone in the midst of retirement, what led you there? How did you get here?
Yeah, well, I should first say that when I was 17, 18 years old, my dream was always to be in my wisdom years. So it's interesting. I was a kid, 16 years old, and I was reading Proverbs at that time because I thought like King Solomon in the wisdom literature was what I always wanted. So I've always pursued that, but I only have some gray hairs yet. You can see some of those gray hairs. Yes,
There's a
I
few,
am
not many.
career. Yeah. So what led me to writing the book was I had spent most of my career asking about how Christian faith shapes our work, and it's an important question because for most people, work is a major part of our adult life. But then there's this whole other season called retirement. Sometimes it starts in mid-50s, sometimes it doesn't start till mid-70s. But what I kept on coming across when I was speaking at churches was pastors would say, look, I've got a lot of people in this season of life. I can't just talk about work. I have to talk to my whole congregation about this broader concept of vocation. So I started to doing some investigating what might faith say to the season of retirement. And I didn't find much in terms of a theological view of retirement out there. There's a handful of books, but I thought they were a little off in some of the frameworks. And so I decided to dive in, talk to people, do some research on retirement, as well as what might Scripture say to this season of life, in order to just give people practical wisdom and potentially some direction on what God is calling us to in the season of retirement.
Yeah, that's great. So as you were researching, as you were asking a bunch of these questions, what kind of came up to the surface, either from people that you interviewed or the contrast of a biblical view of retirement versus a cultural view of retirement?
Yeah, so I think the cultural view of retirement, pretty typical, is that retirement is an ongoing vacation. You've saved a bunch of money and now you get to put your feet up for a long time. Work was terrible or it was least painful. And now what you get to do is, suck the fruit of the land, right? Or you spend down that corpus that you've been saving up. And I just think we need to question some of the paradigms around retirement. So I think a lot of people are thinking about that. Some people can't actually afford that vision. And I would say a lot of Americans cannot afford that vision. So that can cause some frustration and jealousy and some cultural, I would just say, battles. And then I would say there's also some people that do have a vision of sort of social service or how am I going to give back to my community? And that's a good vision. But I did want to take a step back, at least in the book, and say, if these are some cultural paradigms about retirement, what might Scripture say? Can it give us a simple or a little bit more of a comprehensive framework that both acknowledges work seasons do change, we do get older, and there's something about work and vocation that we're meant for over the course of a lifetime. So I tried to actually create this middle way when I was writing the book that I hadn't heard much about.
Yeah, no, that's good. Well, and I was even in the car with my dad this morning, and he just turned 70 over the weekend, and I was taking him back to the airport, and I was sharing a little bit about this conversation we were going to have, and that idea of at some point you are going to have to slow down, whether you are 20, 30, 40, 50, life just starts to change. And even as Spencer and I have talked about it, what we could do 15 years ago is vastly different. So as you've thought about this idea of, okay, entering those wisdom years, the years towards retirement, what does shift and how do we start thinking about a biblical framework for the reality of aging, the reality of life circumstances changing and needing to change in retirement?
Yes. Well, I'd love to meet Mr. McLaughlin someday and have that conversation in the car potentially. I think at least a few things. So the Bible doesn't obviously speak directly at the theme of retirement, other than one particular passage in Numbers 8 where it talks about retiring Levitical priests. And in that passage, it talks about them essentially laying down the hard physical labor of hauling around the tabernacle and letting the younger guys do it. But they were still sitting at the tent of the tabernacle, and they were ministering to their brothers, the other priests, which is interesting. You could see there is a sort of a seasonal shift in life of lay down the young guy's work, but take up the work of giving, of mentoring, of caring, of offering your wisdom to others. So I think the simplest, way to put, I'll summarize in a second in one sentence, but a simple way to put how the Bible sees this is the word elder. And so when we hear the word elder in our culture, maybe we think about elderly, which is either advanced old age or just an insult, or we think about it in terms of the church and like a position in a church, you're on an elder board. And there's very good reasons there are elder boards because of how the New Testament uses that word. But in the Old Testament, elder, those were the leaders of Israel. These were tended to be older, and they tended to be men, and they were leading the community. They were making decisions. And so one of the illustrations I wrote about in the book was not actually from the biblical narrative, but Cicero. When Cicero was 80, he was appearing in court on behalf of his friends. He was learning Greek. He was reading ancient history in his time. Like, he was very much alive, and he wasn't going to battle, but he was very much caring for his community with what God had given to him, right? In Cicero's own non-Christian way, though he wrote some incredible stuff. So what does the Bible say? What I write in the book, and maybe we could unpack this a little bit, is I think Scripture calls us to consider a season of rest, renewal, and re-engagement as elders with wisdom and blessing for a coming generation. So there's a handful of aspects of that we could potentially unpack, but I think that would be my one sentence summary of what I think the Bible says about retirement.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I think that was one thing that you even cued me in of this idea of sabbatical that you dive into here. And how do we rest? How do we regenerate? How do we then re-engage? I think that's such a crucial thing that we have not wrestled with, because as you mentioned in the book, and as we've talked with clients, it's the rate of heart attack and depression the moment that you quit working and have essentially open doors to whatever is next. I think it just produces either depression or anxiety or heart attack for a lot of men in their early 60s. So as you think about this idea of rest and the importance of it, unpack that a little bit for us.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. There is some research that retirement can be very bad for your health. And I would say it's usually worse for men than for women. Women usually have more of a fluid kind of concept of retirement because their careers have usually been more fluid between family and work. For men, it's been a little bit more black and white, and it tends to be more of a hard cutoff in retirement, and it can be very tough for your health. Yeah, and so, in that season, what I recommend in the book is thinking about this concept of sabbatical. Again, sabbatical is usually something that maybe a pastor or a scholar does, but the vast majority of people have never really taken 6 months or 12 months off of work. CEOs that sell their company, maybe that, but the vast majority of people have never really done that. And I think, again, that's sort of a middle way, because it's acknowledging that a lot of people, after they've worked a career and they've been in a job, there's pain. There's a readiness to lay it down. Like, I don't want to do that anymore. Maybe I don't have enough energy. Maybe lots of things. There is a real pain there, right? But sabbatical is for a time. So in Leviticus 25, if you let the land lay fallow for a year, you let it lay fallow for a year and you see what the Lord does and provide for you in the future. But there's a time component to it. So in the book, I lay out 9 different practices of people to think about planning an early retirement. Very intentional season of rest. So this could be hobbies, it could be worship, it could be visiting people, it could be acts of justice and working and seeing community members that you've never had the time to slow down and see. So there's a handful of things I write there, but I think the important thing is also that sabbatical comes to an end. There is an end date, and that's the difference between that and the cultural vision of retirement is an ongoing vacation. There's a kind of a need to always find more, better things to do and to prove that you're actually the carefree, fun person in retirement and you've got it all together, right? Rather than the human story still is the human story. There is difficulty and pain in whatever context, right? So I just think it pushes against that aspect the cultural aspect of retirement says, be really intentional with the season and give yourself a season of rest. It makes a lot of sense to actually give yourself seasons of rest. And frankly, if we could do it every 7 years throughout our career and take a year off, think how you'd feel,
Yeah.
right? Like, just think how you'd feel if you let the land lay fallow 1 year out of every 7 and you just didn't work. I think there's some very practical challenges in the American economy. You're doing it for most people, but there is a day of rest, but there also needs to be seasons of rest to renew our interior world and get ready for whatever the Lord has next for us.
Well, and it's so interesting, even just anecdotally, Jeff, we see clients so often move towards retirement. And then within maybe a month, those who are really high energy and very active, oftentimes they'll get some kind of an offer to come back as a consultant or come back, in some capacity. And they'll just jump on it because they don't have that maybe guidance of take 6, 12 months and let's just rest. And it kind of can go back and forth in this kind of season of intense work and then burnout and then coming back and forth, rather than, I think what you're getting at here is really being intentional and being in a posture of listening to the Lord.
Yeah.
Maybe on that next season, which, is just, again, it's one of those uncommon elements of that you highlight in the book, one of those pro tips, so to speak, that, we love seeing because it is an uncommon view.
Yeah, and I think that hopping back in too quickly, well, I mean, there's two errors. There can be hopping back in too quickly or never hopping at all and saying, I'm never doing any of that again. And that tends to be actually divided pretty quickly around those that really enjoyed their work and want to get back into it. So they're entrepreneurs, professionals, or whatever. And then the majority of the American workforce, that's like, I was paid to do that. I'm never going to do that again. I'm not going to just go, if I worked at Walmart for a career, I'm not just going to go scan stuff in the basement just to stay busy. It's just not what you do, right? It's a different framework. But I do think there is that question of purpose and why do you hop in so quickly into something else? I've seen this with business owners that sell and they'll sometimes get into something too quickly. They feel a void in their life and they want to fill that void very quickly. And as a Christian, I believe that void can only be filled with the life of God.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have to actually you have to grieve, you have to let go. Just like as when kids move out of the house, there's a grieving and a letting go and allowing God to fill us. And so that when we re-engage, it's not from an empty place or a place of seeking to sort of extract life from something, but to give life that God has given me to something. So that's why I think even some discipline around that sabbatical, and I'm open to what that looks like, right? In terms of how long and what are some of those activities. But even if you really did have a great opportunity, it would probably be there in 6 months or 12 months or some close version of it, especially if that's the way the Lord's leading you to continually professionally contribute in some respect.
You've kind of been hinting at it, but you probably have an opportunity, at least some of our clients, I think, would have an opportunity even prior to that retirement stage if they're making a move between companies, say 5, 10, 15 years prior to retirement, but they find it's just a grind, in the midst of their career or maybe the load of responsibilities. You've recently written a book, Working from the Inside Out, and of course thought a lot about vocation and calling. Is there an opportunity maybe for folks who are second half of their careers and they're feeling that intensity, maybe to do something similar, maybe in a smaller way if they're in a transition? How do you think about that, maybe in context of what we've just talked about?
Yeah, a couple of thoughts on that. You guys are wealth advisors, so there's certain seasons that are very expensive and some that are less expensive. So I am 41 and I'm in an expensive time in my career. And I think that, life has seasons. It's okay. Like there's just, the volleyball and the soccer and the traveling tournaments and then the house and then them just eating everything like through the walls too. They're not rats. They're beautiful daughters. I have 4 daughters, but they just eat everything. And so there are expensive times, but it is worth pausing in the middle of a career, to your question, to think, am I working from a real place of fullness or anxiety, depression, burnout, panic? I have to meet all these budgetary concerns, right? I have a friend, his name is Abraham. He works at a hospital and prestigious medical school, and he had the choice to go anywhere he wanted afterwards. And he decided to work at a public hospital serving our city's poor. And he just said, look, I could have made 3 or 4 times as much, but this is where I felt called to be. and he fits his lifestyle with respect to where God is calling him to work and to serve. So I do think a lot of the burnout stuff comes from like, what are these desires that are disordered in our heart and that are really driving us to the ground, right? Is it the identity thing of, I need to have the bigger house to prove my worth, to somebody else? But there's a lot of these things that are sort of underneath the surface that drive us to getting really tired and exhausted. Why scale quickly? Like there's a lot of these questions that we need to ask, because I do think if God is calling us to something, it'll be for our best and for our good, to do that and to work in that. And so I do think we have to really question in terms of like, what is actually causing me to feel this way about my life and my work right now? And Lord, what would you have me lay down so that I might take up something greater, right? Like a greater fullness from God. And I think those are, not all work is up and to the right. God might be calling you down and to the left, or down and to the right, maybe a better graph metaphor there. But he may have called you to make less, work less, and say, time is more important than income right now, right? So these are all important questions for a person of the kingdom walking through, like, what does it look like to walk alongside people in a really holistic way?
Well, and that resonates a lot, just because if we don't have prayer lives that actually allow us to listen to the Lord and engage with him through the day and build those disciplines, it just feels fruitless in so many ways. Even if we add zeros, or if we add, accolades, or size of company, or whatever it might be, if we don't do it listening to the Lord and being obedient, he says, I own the cattle on 1,000 hills and such. So I appreciate your wisdom on that.
So Jeff, I think one of the questions that I've kind of been percolating, as you and Spencer were just sharing there, is this idea that as we come to the Lord with both our current season of work and our future season of work, we really need to come with a posture of open hands. And so how do we wrestle with this when so much of our culture is saying, go for the extra zero, go for the 3 times multiplier for your value of your salary? Like, how do we slow down and encounter Jesus and allow him to speak in to who we are, so that we can really, slow down and rest in him with our posture towards work, with our posture towards retirement?
Yeah. Well, a couple of thoughts on that. I think when we move fast, when anxiety is creeping at the door, when we have found ourselves drawn more and more to having more and being more, we do need to pause and say, why am I doing this? To what end? And that's always a question of desire. What do I really want, and why do I want it? So Jesus's first question to his disciples in the Gospel of John is, what do you want me to do for you? It's an interesting question. What do you really want here? And I do think with you guys' work as wealth advisors, as well as with even just pastors in general, asking people, what do you really want and why do you want it, is a very good question. And just let people sit with that, right? Because it's like, when you think about the house, we're thinking about moving. We may have a bigger house. We have 4 kids. We kind of need the space, but maybe we don't need the space too. I don't know. We're wrestling with this. We're going back and forth, right? We have not only thought about, square feet and dollars that are going to be coming out of our bank account, but we're also thinking about, what do we want and why do we want it? And those are really important questions that I think drive the other ones. Very practically, there are spiritual disciplines that people can do and build into their life around desires and wants. So there is, in Ignatian spirituality, there is kind of a foundation of it called the principle and the foundation. And even just reading the principle and the foundation, I can send a link to you guys as well, if that would be helpful. It really causes us to question if the real goal of our life is life with God, that he gives us the gifts of the world to experience him. However, when the gifts of the world displace him, everything gets disordered. We actually have to regularly practice letting go of even good gifts, especially when our heart grasps down on them rather than receives them in freedom. And that's a very gray line in somebody's heart, right? When have you received a house as a gift in freedom from the Lord? And when is it like, that's Gollum, right? That's mine. That's my precious. That's the thing I have to have. We could ask these about a lot of things, but the end of the principle of foundation, a newer translation of it, says our one and only choice should be this: I want and I choose whatever leads to the deepening of God's life within. That could be health. It could be sickness. It could be a long life. It could be a short life. It could be success. It could be failure. Either way, the great gift is free and offered to us right now. And so doing those different things and reminding ourselves, what do I want? When are these things displacing my great joy, my real treasure? And then how do I regularly hold things open-handedly and be okay if I got the deal or I lost the deal, if I got the job or if I lost the job? Either one of those, like, can you be full and okay in either of those contexts? There are disciplines we can build into our life that bring about freedom, because I think a lot of our culture tends to say you need to have that to be okay. And then we grasp down further and further into that. And that's more like bondage.
Well, even as you were talking, I was thinking about some of those questions that we regularly ask clients. I think we do ask the what do you want? What are those dreams, visions, goals that you have for this next season? But I think even as we ask them, sometimes it's harder to get to that why. Why is that important? Why is travel or family or those other things important? And I think it's because we see what we think should be important, but we maybe haven't spent that time with the Lord to really wrestle with why is it important. Even as I think about times that I have either purchasing decisions or career decisions. Well, yeah, I may want it, but that why piece always seems like the most critical of what's really important. What's getting at it is my heart soft towards the Lord, or is it desirous of just things that I want, and not why maybe the Lord wants to form me in a different direction? That's really,
Yeah.
I think, a good question to ask.
Yeah. And just to give you an illustration, in our life right now, as we're thinking about moving, we're sort of in between. We don't have a ton of clarity of whether the Lord would have us stay in our home and practice contentment in a smaller house with six of us. You can hear the subtext of that. Or whether you have us move. We remodeled our kitchen back in 2018, and I remember walking in after the contractor just put the countertops in, and I wept. And I wept because it felt like an elaborate gift that I didn't deserve. And I felt so excited that my family could eat there and we could enjoy times together in that place. And it looked beautiful. And I was proud and excited, and I just wept praise at that time. So the heart can go either way. Again, I hope your listeners don't buy more things. There are good things to do with money, right? Like there's definitely good things, but not only what do you want, but why do you want it? What if all wealth advisors ask that, right? Or even the 5 whys. Just keep going down into the why to get to those real root desires we have. And if we can get those, at the end of the day, Christ is the only one that will meet all those root desires, right? And then when we get to that point, the experiences, the work, the things that we purchase or don't purchase, that can be gifts. That can be gifts from His hand.
Yeah.
Well, it's so good to hear you grapple with that and see both sides of it, of being able to rejoice at the good gifts that God gives, and also grapple, with the role as steward. It resonates a lot with us. We've got 4 kiddos as well, and added a room in the back as we adopted our youngest. And at the same time, we're on top of each other at times, and kids come to us and say, it'd be really nice if we had one more room. And say, well, we can't add on anymore. And we've got, 5 families from church within 2 blocks of us. So there's this sense of community, for us as we kind of grapple with that, Jeff, that's a little bit different than, a lot of folks get, but it's that constant coming back and saying, Lord, what are you up to here? How do we be faithful in the midst of this? And, I love that, you're open about grappling with the emotions that you feel and going back and forth, because we certainly feel the same. There's times that my wife and I are just like, oh man, it'd be so nice if we had a little more. But that's not what the Lord has said, at this point. And so being, I think, comfortable with that and acknowledge, even our emotions in the midst of it just feels really healthy. That, this side of heaven, we're going to need to, grapple with things and turn them back over to the Lord at times.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's a good word.
So, Jeff, I kind of want to come back to some of the pieces that you talked about earlier, and this idea of a season of rest, because I think that pairs well with this idea. If we don't know how to rest, then we probably don't know how to stop and listen to the Lord about these why questions. And so as you think about this idea of sabbatical or Sabbath and rest, how do we tangibly take steps towards that? I think that there are some things that you put in the book that were helpful, but what are maybe some of those practical elements that we can do to stop and to fight against this cultural milieu of what you need to do versus maybe what the Lord is prompting in those emotional why questions?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think on the interior side, I think the reason for Sabbath, as I wrote a little bit about in my book, one is to trust the Lord. He'll provide for you in the future. That was a core reason why Sabbath existed, is that he had his people regularly look to him saying, look, I brought you out of Egypt as slaves. Remember, I will provide everything for you. So I think that trust piece is really important on an interior disposition. The identity piece as well is that you are mine, you are my child, you are one of God's people as a core part of it. You are not what you produce. And Americans need to hear that. You're not what you produce. You're not your LinkedIn profile. This is not fundamentally who you are. You are who I say you are. And I think that identity piece is always a struggle because culture is trying to put stuff on us and we're trying to put stuff on ourselves as well. And then I think the justice piece, like there was the reason for Sabbath was as saying, not only should you not do any work, but neither your male or female servants, your animals, or your foreigner residing in your town should do any work. Like it gave space to community, to other people having a space of rest and restoration rather than the nonstop slavery of work, which can look like a lot of the American experience, right? So you'd ask some practical, questions too. I think you can put it on your calendar. I'm going to take 6 months. You can prepare for it, right? You can create a launch feast with your friends saying, we're starting a sabbatical here. What should we learn and what should we remember, right? What do rhythms of Sabbath look like here when we're doing hobbies or recreational activities? How can we use that for God to actually shape and form us and being paying attention to, like, are we cranking out work, or in our hearts, are we allowing God to work in and through us, right? There can be practices of remembrance. There can be practices of caring for the poor. There can be just practices of getting rid of stuff you don't need and more simplicity for the sake of having more joy in your life. Practices of learning and renewing your mind. So there's a lot of things that we can do in a Sabbath structure. And I do actually find that the biggest concern when I talk about that with folks is saying, I could not do nothing for 9 months. My head would fall off. Well, God doesn't really, like when you look at the Sabbath, like Jewish festivals or even in the Old Testament, like there was community, there was feasting, there was worship. There was a lot of stuff going on. It just wasn't you cranking out work, right? And so for us to actually think about these different things that are not intrinsically productive, but are very good, we can build those into a schedule in a way that doesn't have to be nuts, but it still is a different kind of a rhythm that feels more like a Sabbath world than a productive world.
Yeah, that's good. Well, Jeff, thanks so much for walking us through some of the practical elements of retirement. Where can folks find you, find your book?
Well, you can find me in Denver, Colorado if you want to come and travel out. It's a beautiful place. It's where I live with my family, just on the south side of the city. JeffHaanen.com is some of my writing, Haanen. So JeffHaanen.com. And then my book is on Amazon, Working from the Inside Out, as well as Uncommon Guide to Retirement. So you can find them both there.
Awesome. Thanks, Jeff. Well, we'll link both of those in the show notes below. We look forward to seeing you guys next time, where we're going to talk with Jeff about calling. If you found this episode valuable, share it with a friend and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform so that you don't miss the next episode.
This content was provided by Second Half Stewardship. We are in Knoxville, Tennessee, and you can visit our website at www.secondhalfstewardship.com. The information in this recording is intended for general educational and informational purposes only and should not be construed as investment advisory, financial planning, legal, tax, or other professional advice based on your specific situation. Please consult your professional advisor before taking any action based on its contents.